Hello, everybody, and welcome to the University of Washington Taiwan Studies YouTube channel and the continuing series of interviews on various kinds of research that are important to Taiwan studies. My name is Steve Harrell. I was a UW professor for 43 years, and I did a lot of anthropological fieldwork in Taiwan, particularly in the middle to late 20th century. And now I'm retired and doing things like interviews. Today's guest, we're very honored to have Professor Jing Xu, or Xu Jing, as it would be in Chinese, who is a anthropologist who got her PhD from the other Washington University, or the other Washington Daxue, which is to say Washington University, whom everyone who speaks Chinese gets confused with the University of Washington, and has been living in Seattle and working in the University of Washington as an anthropologist and a psychologist for a long time now, so since 2014, and has recently, it's actually not that recent, maybe 3 years ago, published a really superior book called The Good Child, Moral Education in a Chinese Preschool with the Stanford University Press. But today, we're going to talk with Dr. Xu about a new project, a new and exciting project, which is really actually an old project. And by that I mean, in the fall or in the summer of 1958, a Cornell University graduate student by the name of Arthur Wolff and his wife, Margery Wolff, his wife at the time, went to a village in near Shulin in what's now New Taipei City, was then Taipei County, to undertake a 2-year period of anthropological field research on child development, which was part of a larger cross-cultural study that was being hosted at Harvard and Cornell universities. They did hardly anything as far as publishing the results of this study. Arthur Wolff went on to become a distinguished leader in psychological anthropology and in sort of biopsychological anthropology, a long career at Stanford University. And full disclosure, he was one of my graduate advisors. And Margery Wolff, who never received a college degree, nevertheless wrote 4 really important books based on this fieldwork. The most well-known, the best known of these, was called The House of Lim, which was a kind of a family history that was used for a long time as a textbook in introductory anthropology courses and a lot of other kinds of China studies courses. But as I say, the large amount of data that Arthur and Margery Wolff and their assistants collected with regard to child development in this village mostly went unused. And Arthur Wolff died in 2015, and his wife at the time, Professor Hill Gates, who was a classmate of mine actually in Taipei, Hill contacted me and said, did I know anyone who might be interested in taking this huge archive of quantitative and observational field data from Taiwan in between 1958 and 1960, and doing something productive and interesting with it. And at that time, I had just become acquainted with Dr. Xu, and I said, Hill, I think I have exactly the person for you. So this is how the whole project got started. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Xu to say a little bit about how she got involved and how that fits with her background. And then we'll be talking about some specific aspects of this study.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. It's a great honor to be part of the interview series and to be a guest of your interview. And actually, this project, as you just said, was through you, your connection, and it was kind of a magic for me that this for me, it still seems like a windfall opportunity. But it's true that it is not very common for an anthropologist at my time who is interested in studying child development and using psychological approaches. So in that sense, I think I'm a kind of a good fit for this project. And before taking on this project, as Steve said, I actually did my dissertation research, also used anthropology and psychology to look at preschool children's development in contemporary middle-class urban Shanghai. That was the book was published in 2017 by Stanford University Press. So it's been 5 years since then, and really time to write up the second book. And I'm really extremely lucky to have this opportunity to be actually sitting here and analyzing field notes, as opposed to having to be really worried about doing field work at this pandemic time, and which is really obstructing many anthropologists' planned career in many different ways. So now I am doing this. I am trying to write up this my second book based on the materials left behind by Arthur Wolf. Generally speaking, I study child development as a window in looking into human culture, human mind, and human morality, education, and family in general. That is, I have to say, not a very common approach taken on in anthropology or social sciences, but to me, it is really a fascinating field, a fascinating approach to look at these issues through looking at the developing child. And as Steve just said, Arthur's research at that time in the mid-20th century was at the heyday of psychological anthropology, where anthropologists at the time would be familiarized with some sort of psychological theories and methods, and child socialization at that time was seen as a very important topic to look at human culture and society. Unfortunately, now we're seeing a revival of that interest of cross-cultural developmental research looking at childhood, at learning, education across a lot of different disciplines. And the very research that Arthur started as a kind of improved replication of the landmark research, the 6 culture study of child socialization in anthropology, is still being remembered, and the spirit is carried on in this revival movement of studying child development across cultures to look at a bunch of very fundamental issues facing humanity, such as the origins of human cooperation. How do we get along with each other? Human morality and other issues in anthropology, in even some biological sciences, in behavioral cognitive sciences in general. So that is a general historical review of the field that I am in and topics I'm interested in looking at.
I think our Taiwan Studies audience might be a little bit puzzled. Somebody who comes from Hunan originally, what's she doing research in Taiwan? And how does research in Taiwan relate to the earlier field research that you did in Shanghai, with Taiwan and China now being separated for over almost 80 years, but nevertheless having common cultural roots. So could you say something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, yes, I grew up in China from Hunan province, and my first research was done in Shanghai, so all in contemporary China context. But I see very interesting linkages between these two contexts. First of all, from a personal history perspective, there are things that really fascinated me. When I think about myself, and I grew up in a family, and my grandmother, my paternal side grandmother, was actually a little daughter-in-law, Simpua, as Arthur, his research, his whole lifetime research was focused on. And I feel the sort of intimacy to this research, and it kind of part of the reason and puzzle. And I was trying to see how how is it like for children raised by mothers who are simple, is like very different sort of a child rearing ideals than what we are familiarized with in quote unquote modern context, this urban modern context in China and the US and elsewhere. And also the time of this research, it was is quite interesting. It's kind of my parents' generation, these very children that I'm now writing about. It really reminds me of my parents' childhood, because my parents grew up, they were born in the 1950s, so the same age as these children I'm writing about, even though I've never met them and probably will not have the opportunity to meet all of them. And they grew up in an environment, as you know, the Great Leap Forward and famine and waves of social movement, which is quite different from Taiwan. But in a sense, there's also connection through all kinds of factors and in history. So I wanted to understand what it is like growing up in my parents' generation, but in a very different context, geographical and historical context. I have to say, studying children, I always have this also more universalistic concern, if you will. They are children, after all, growing up everywhere in every corner of the world. There are also commonalities, and that's something that fascinates me in my previous research and now. So back to the question that Steve just asked about studying Shanghai versus now. For example, in my research in Shanghai, it was kind of a newer age of parenting in China, which was departing from the quote-unquote traditional, which was probably similar to what I've seen in this archive, emphasizing on children obedience and 听话 and that. But by the time I was studying in Shanghai, it was changing really fast. So children were socialized in a new environment. But then I think in a way, what fascinates me is children's own world, their experience, they as agents, rather than just objects to be shaped by parenting discourses, socialization strategies. In that sense, the preschoolers in Shanghai are no different from the children running around in this Taiwanese village. They're all playing, growing up, in a sense, working and learning, sorting out their social environment and constructing a sense of self. And that sort of creativity in children's growing mind is also a kind of a center of my research. Another thing is I wanted to emphasize, as an anthropologist, methodologically, it is not, even though one think of it as maybe intuitively easy to study children, but I'm so glad that I have that experience studying children in the Shanghai preschool that really taught me of humility, because when you're facing young children, you want to study them, and it's not that straightforward. So that kind of research experience prepared me for approaching these materials to appreciate, okay, what is behind this data that we're seeing now of children playing, and how does the researcher fit into that picture? How is the researcher's presence probably affecting the children's behavior, and why children are talking to this researcher, opening up, but probably more hesitant in some other context, or facing a more distant researcher. So these are more detailed questions we can talk about later, but the gist is, I think that past research also prepares me well to take on this challenge of analyzing children's lives through historical texts. I think a final point I want to emphasize between the Shanghai preschoolers and this historical nodes of Taiwanese children is my own personal experience as a mother too, sort of factored in how I approach those children and their families. So in Shanghai, it really taught me a lesson that was empathy. It was so hard to be raising children in a super competitive environment like urban Shanghai today, or 10 years ago. Today is now even worse, the competition. So parents were very, very anxious. And me as a parent in that environment could feel that. And it helped me put myself as a researcher into a perspective. So back to this research, it is a very different situation, of course, but empathy is still a very important element especially for anthropologists facing people who might not be the same as you, whose positionality and so on and so forth. One example, we can judge parenting strategies or their ideas or their beliefs as not good parenting, as we tend to, especially now in the Western society, we tend to make those sort of judgments. But then I need to take a step back. When I hear parents screaming at children or yelling at them or cursing them, as a parent, as a mom myself, I feel for it. Imagine a mother in the village was so busy with her work, with her taking care of her family, and a bunch of children nagging behind her. It is a very demanding situation. So I can understand why I'm seeing certain sort of scenarios in this archive. So long story short, I think that also helped me to understand and write about it from a somewhat more empathic perspective.
And those mothers, we should point out, also had an average of about 6 or 7 children, which of course is something very different from either Shanghai or Taipei, New Taipei City today, where the average is a little over 1. I think maybe you could say something a little bit more about the data here. What do you have to work with? You can't, I mean, presumably someday you will get to Taiwan, you will get to the former village of Xiaxizhou, and which is all, of course, modern apartment buildings and stores, and there's a lovely riverside park and all kinds of, very nice environment now. But you can't go back to 1958 or 1960. You can't go back to the Kuomintang dictatorship in Taiwan. You can't go back to, you can't ever talk to Arthur Wolf or Margery Wolf because they both died. So what do you have to work with, and how does this constrain your work?
Yeah, thank you. That is the fundamental question haunting me for years, ever since I went to visit Hill in Santa Rosa and got to really see these nodes for myself. I was really moved, and I was really kind of overwhelmed when I stepped into Arthur's library and saw the nodes, and like scanning in a very old printer, trying to scan the materials as much as I could. And I never met Arthur or Margery, which is a pity. But I saw his boots still there. He's working under the desk in his library. And at some point, I think I cried when I was like reading through the materials and looking up, because Arthur also has left a couple chapters, draft chapters, before he died, when he was trying to write this book himself. And I was looking at the manuscript, and I was looking at these very detailed notes and trying to scan, and then there's problem of scanning and so on and so forth. And looking through the window to this beautiful scenery in up on the ranch, and Steve, you visited a few times, I felt quite unreal that why am I here and doing this? And it's quite lucky, of course. I also felt the sort of a sense of a burden or mission to paint it a more positive way, that this is a very important archive of historical significance to quite a few fields and to many people. So I have to, and I don't have a choice, I have to try my best to make sense of this archive. Of course, historians might need to worry less when they are analyzing textual materials archive, but anthropologists, I do worry because, as you said, that is the biggest challenge. I don't have that first person experience being there at the time of the fieldwork. And that sort of experience in my past career, in my the past decade of my research, that was something that I hold on dearly to make any claim about whatever I am writing, right? Because we're there, I know those people, I'm confident writing, oh, so-and-so is such kind of person. He did this and that because of this and that. But now all I have are the notes. So to the notes, they are quite remarkable. I have to say, I will never have in my own lifetime, if I am to collect field notes, another project, I will never have that sort of abundant and systematic materials and that sort of scientific rigor, which is, I think, largely due to Arthur's. He was a scientist to begin with, and also due to the legacy of the Six Culture Study, which was really unprecedented at that time. So the archive, what I call the Wolf Archive, is it's a mix of different types of data. It has the most conventional type of data that anthropologists work with, which is observational materials about children interacting in a natural context with their parents, their siblings, peers, or other people in the village. So that is called child observation. That is the core type of material in this archive. But other than that, there are also different types of materials to complement. One interview, for example, and it's very standardized interview with both mothers and their children. And there's also observations of mothers interacting with their children. And the very reason, the backstage story that was added onto the original Six Culture Studies field guide was because Arthur was a little bit skeptical. Okay, so these mothers, they were saying these things. How do we know they're really speaking the truth rather than just resorting to their norm? So he started another type of data, which is mother observation too. Okay, let's see if what they say actually conform to what they're doing in their real life while interacting with their children. And in addition to interviews and observations, we also have quite unconventional type of data from today's standard, which is psychological tests. At that time, it's called projected tests. There are two types of tests, TAT and dog play. Essentially, it is to sort of resorting to some standardized prompt and to help children elicit their responses. So give children some pictures in TAT, or give children a set of dolls of portraying a farmhouse family and have children start telling stories. That was more common in that time, but today it's still, for me, very, very interesting. A lot of insights from those materials. So these three types of data, and plus the demographic information, we have all the children's detailed birthday, their gender, their household information, and adults information too. And that is very, very precious. So I can do all kinds of comparison, linking the demographic data to these behavioral and interview data. So that is what I am working with. And back to what Steve just started in the beginning. I never visited the village. I had it in my dreams because maybe I'm so familiar, I'm so invested in this project. I one day I had a dream that, okay, I was in front of the village because I also was looking at Google Map, trying to identify the elementary school, Shalun Guoxiao, and other markers in that area. So I had a dream of myself visiting the village, but it was different in the dream from in real life, from Google Maps or from the actual site in the late 1950s. Yeah, so that's the materials I'm working with and the challenge facing.
Yeah, say something I think is interesting to our audience about how they collected these materials. Because it was a real enterprise. It was not the one anthropologist off, canoeing 6 days away from the nearest missionary medical post and picking fruit in the jungle. I mean, it wasn't that sort of typical thing. It was an enterprise. Can you say something about the data collection enterprise, maybe briefly, but at least introduce our audience to that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as Steve said, it is not the lone anthropologist kind of work. It is a teamwork. It is very collaborative, and it has different sort of intermediate agents. So Arthur was the supervisor who designed this research and was in charge of assigning which child to observe today, for example. And Margery Wolf, she did a lot of, she did some observations too, but she did a lot of typing the data into the English notes using a typewriter at that time. And then they hired 3 research assistants, 2 collecting more data than the third one, but 2 research assistants were local Taiwanese girls who are hired by the Wolf's team to do these observations and interviews, precisely because they could speak children's language, their native language, and they were in age, they were closer to them, and they kind of ended up collecting very, very kind of refined observational data that is kind of eyewitness testimony, because they were in a very good relationship with these children. Again, back to my earlier point of working with children is not that easy. I think it was very smart for Arthur to hire these 2 girls to hang out with children, and they lived with the wolves in the village too. And the third research assistant, Mr. Huang, later co-authored the book with Arthur on marriage and family, the big book about adoption, and he was in charge of collecting the projective test data. And I actually spoke to him. Fortunately, he lives in the US, and I did some oral history interview. He told me that children would be scared if they have to talk to Arthur directly. If Arthur were to interview the children, they'd be scared. They'd be reluctant to come. So that shows the complexity of what we know today, how these data come into being.
Okay, so I think I'd like to turn to what you've been finding out. What surprised you the most, having grown up in a culturally Han household, a culturally Han community, which this certainly is, Holo-speaking Taiwanese, and having done intensive field work with children, having a son of your own, what did you not expect to find that you found in these data?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I think what really surprised me and is a humbling experience is that precisely because I didn't live in that area, and I would assume my parents, for example, thinking about my parents' childhood, I would think their childhood must be kind of not interesting, boring, and maybe oppressive because, the political time. And in Taiwan too, that was, of course, there was, in the general political atmosphere was like that. And we don't know much about actual children's experience at the time. So what really surprised me is that their childhood is rather colorful and interesting, even though they don't have the sorts of advanced video games or toys or things to play with. And the earlier generation scholars even sort of accused that, okay, these rural children in this sort of environment, China or Taiwan, would have not have good amount of imagination or emotional world. And contrary to that, which is dear to my own interest, studying children, is that children, they have a very complex social life, moral understanding, and emotional inner life. And that is, for me, the most interesting lesson I have learned, or interesting finding. Of course, due to and thanks to the the good quality of these data.
Give us an example or two that
Okay.
demonstrated this to you.
Yeah, for example, I would assume, as a girl, I would assume, okay, the girls were, of course, they were the not preferred ones, and their life may be miserable. Yes, their life is not. They're living a poor life at that time, and so on and so forth. But when some girls were going onto a riverside to wash diapers for their cousins, for the younger babies in their family, they started playing a game. They started chanting, and they started making fun of the research assistant, the girl who them call older sister Chen. And they kind of compose a little song to mock her. And while washing diapers, it was like, if I wash diapers myself as a mother, and that's the nature of being a child. I think the fun nature of it, that was really that is for me so precious. Just one small example. Or another example is we'd assume that children disobedience and filial piety, so on and so forth, this quote-unquote traditional Han Chinese family in a patriarchal society. And you see that children are learned to be very obedient, but they are actually not. I call them somewhat unruly children from a parent's perspective. They defy parental command, and they mock parents. So parents will spank them, right, when children do not behave well, or when parents got into this bad mood. And children, they acted that out. In one observation, for example, this girl, and it's a girl, to emphasize that she's sort of a leader in that play group, and she started playing mother figure with a bunch of children trailing her, and she started spanking these children, and these children were pretending. It's all in the pretend play, and all kind of very hilarious and laughing sentiment. And these children were just begging, "Mother, please do not hit us," and pretending to be crying and all that. And I just feel like, okay, I learned something from that. They are building their own understanding. There's sort of a channeling their discontent of parental punishment of their authority into this sort of mockery, play, and humor. So that is another example to sort of demonstrate what I just said, the very colorful and fun nature of children and their inner world.
Yeah, I remember this too from living in a village not very far, about 12 kilometers away, about 11 or 12 years later than this. Children being very creative with games. And there was one game, I don't remember what they were doing, but what the loser had to do was to go and drink a glass of water out of the tap without boiling it. Because everybody boiled their water. There was no chlorination, there was no water sanitation, and you could easily get everything up to and including cholera if you drank unboiled water. But this was the game they'd invented, and the loser had to just down a glass of it. He was fine. But yeah, this kind of creativity, you don't have to, as you say, have a lot of toys, a lot of games, a lot of structured activities. You structure your own activities. I wanted to ask you about something that I know you've been working on, which has to do with the study of children in general, whether it's in anthropology or psychology, that has traditionally concentrated on socialization. How do parents raise children, and how do children interact with their parents, whether it's in a filial obedient way, or whether it's in an evasive way, or whether they make fun of them when the parents aren't around, or whatever. But I think you found that the children are much more important for each other. In addition to the importance of the children, of the parents in children's lives, you had older children older siblings, play group members, neighbors, who are also playing an important role in children's development, cognitive and also moral development. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, for sure. So this is about this children's their what we call non-vertical ties, right? So in my field, yes, as you said, in general, people tend to emphasize the vertical ties as if culture, quote unquote culture, if we're still allowed to use this term as an anthropologist, is transmitted from an older generation, from the authority generation to the younger generation. But actually, more and more studies these days are trying to say that we need to look at, in some instances, is adults learning from children, but more broadly is the horizontal ties of children learning from each other and with each other. And that is especially important when we go back in history to look at human childhood across time and space. Before this nuclear family and urban segregated families and space and all that, children were actually running around in in villages, and they were observing communal life and in play groups. So that sort of peer learning constitutes a very important but understudied a way of from individual perspective of learning culture, learning things, learning moral norms, learning gender norms. But from a societal perspective is how the norms of one generation, of one community, are transmitted, but more importantly, maybe transformed, right? When time goes on and the younger generation coming to age. So that is a kind of a major argument of me writing this book. We need to look at and that, and it's definitely not unique in the sense that we should have known more about this peer interactions had we not used this ideological lens of overemphasizing parenting socialization. For example, I was just reading some new work by a Japan historian who was looking at childhood in the wartime in Japan. And even those children at a very nationalistic time, they were playing more with each other than kind of getting a sort of ideological installation and so on and so forth. They were, so back to the point of studying children, the universal aspects of human children and how we get to persist maybe as humans. And also I wanted to add, when you mentioned children's game creativity, I want to really tell this little story that is one of the game that children are invented that is very ingenious is play anthropologist. And that for that I read from your previous student Maria's dissertation. Arthur in his manuscript, in his draft chapter, also mentioned that. So children imagine at that time these two foreign anthropologists went to live with them in the village, and it's a big thing. It was kind of strange. And what was more strange, they're studying, they're kind of chasing after these kids and kind of trailing them as they play around in different play groups. And they saw Arthur, Margery typing, and the research assistant holding a notebook and following them nonstop. So they invented a game called, they didn't call it play anthropology. They didn't even know what anthropologists mean, but the gist is play anthropology. They were playing one like typing notes, dee da da, on a typewriter, and maybe pretending to ask some questions. And so while researchers are studying children are studying the researchers too. But back to what you.
I'm interested in the scholarship in any field, whether it's an area studies field like Taiwan studies or whether it's a discipline like psychological anthropology. It proceeds by one generation of scholars revising or even refuting the findings of the previous generation of scholars. Now, actually, Arthur is 2 or 3 generations above you, but the when both Arthur, but particularly Margery Wolf, used the experience in the village and the data to write actually a revisionist book called Women in the Family in Rural Taiwan. It's an
Yeah.
important contribution to the study of families, to the study of gender, and to the study of Han Chinese culture and society. And because it centered women rather than seeing women simply as appendages of a patriarchal system. So it's a very important book. At the same time, I have a suspicion that you don't agree with everything she said, and that the data that you find or the insights you find in the data that they collected in this project might give you a somewhat different perspective, both on childhood and socialization, but perhaps also on gender in society at that time. Am I right about that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for sure. I admire Margery's works. The feminist angle was very important to really push the study of quote unquote Chinese families forward. But when it comes to these particular data, because they, first of all, did not systematically analyze at the time Margery was writing Women and Family in Rural Taiwan, for example, and then even the later books, because of no personal computer and all sorts of obstacles, and also partly because of the training and the vision that, I mean, I come to these data with a different vision than my predecessors, which is only natural, and that I am reaching some part of the conclusion is different from what they would have written if they were to write about childhood, particularly in this village. So several points. I will start from the small. For example, Margery and some of her contemporaries talk about the sudden change. I think Arthur too, of parenting, when maybe they were more indulgent towards the younger children than, and later when children reach age. I'm still confused. I think Margery said 7 to 8, and Arthur, when I was looking at the manuscript, he mentioned 5. He had an NSF proposal. He said, oh, by age 5, parents approaching children more harshly, more kind of punishment oriented rather than indulgence. So they both agree to a sudden sort of shift in parenting style. And Arthur, in his NSF proposal, even started to compare with some Swedish sample of parenting. But anyway, what I found through my systematic rereading, which also resorted to programmatic techniques, I found that actually there's not abrupt change in parenting style. For example, when I calculate instances of parents actually physically punishing children, even the 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds got punished, and of course the older children too. And also I found for example, in interview data, in interviews with mothers, many mothers agree that punishment is important, and they think that it's better to start early, because only start early the child will be under control. If you start late, then it will be out of control. So that is one small example of the sort of the difference I found. But beyond that, larger than that, oh, sorry, yeah.
No, I just wanted to add, our experience was that there wasn't this kind of a break in being indulgent with younger children, but that mothers and to sometimes fathers and grandfathers would also be caretakers if they were. It was less common, but not unknown, that they would alternate between punishment and indulgence. And on the one hand, the mothers would get so exasperated. I'll take that. What kind of pussy? I'll beat you to death. Or, 我哋看，啊啲啊，多間啲穿得比較好噃。 Adoga is going to take you back to America, okay, if you don't
Yeah,
behave. That was very common. Or
yeah,
and teasing.
yeah,
Teasing
yeah.
was really important. There was one place where they had a kid who was just learning to walk, and it was just I don't remember if it was a boy or girl, but maybe a little over a year old, and kind of unsteady on his feet, and he was crouched over and ready to stand up, and they put this big rock around his neck on a string so he couldn't stand up, and he tried to stand up and he fell over, tried to stand up and he fell over, tried to stand up and he fell over, and then and then he started wailing, and all these mothers and grandmothers are just cracking up, you know, you know,
Yeah,
playing tricks on little kids. So
yeah.
I mean, I wonder if the data give you more of a picture of inconsistency in the way that the parents treat children rather than some kind of consistent pattern.
Yeah, yeah. I think I agree with you because when we look at the ideals, we want like neat patterns, of course, and we tend to articulate in these sort of neat patterns. But the reality is way more messy, and I think even the parents they admitted that I mean punishment was a big thing, and children fighting was a big thing, and so these two are connected. And some parents will say, some mothers, they're like they just when they are in a bad mood, they would of course punish more than when they are maybe have. For example, when the mother's gambling. I mean, gambling was a very common activity at the time, and the child is nagging on. There's more likely that the mom will just be very annoyed and start yelling or spanking than when the mother was in a less busy or less kind of absorbed state. So there's a lot of inconsistent or variances, which is I think natural to as humans. And as you said, there is a big thing that is grandparents were a big part of a child rearing. Fathers less so, but grandparents, grandmothers, and also grandfathers. So in this one case, I'm going to write about because Arthur he was so interested in adoption and little daughters-in-law and that. So I will write about one little girl. She was an adopted daughter. Of course, they were not gonna at that time. They are not the function is not to be married to their adoptive brother, but she is adopted daughter, and her mom didn't like her that much, and their tension between them, and she was aware of that, but she was a quite a naughty girl. She refused to go to school. She had bad tensions, but the point is. Even though we think that adopted mothers, yeah, these daughters are miserable because the mothers don't love them, but on the other hand, the grandmother, who is not her biological grandmother at all, but is adopted grandmother, but the grandmother is sort of a matriarch in the family. She really adores her because they built some bonding when she was a little baby. So there's tension between the grandmother and the mother, of course, and the grandmother tends to protect her while the adopted mother tends to estrange, like to punish her or do not want to be too close to her. So there's a lot of complexity when it comes to family life and child rearing. I think we all understand that. But in general, there's beyond the kind of a detailed, okay, at what age do they have this or that? I think my orientation is different from Arthur and Margery in the sense that I am more focusing on children as agents, as with their complex thinking and sensibilities and all that. While the wolves, because of their time, the socialization approach, they still kind of tend to emphasize, how do mothering approach, how do mothers' behavior shape children's personality? Arthur, in particular, also had later in his manuscript, which you also read the first two chapters. He came to again to believe that this is inborn knowledge, children's inborn knowledge. So it's kind of a stark contrast between biology and environment or culture or however you want to name it. But for me, I am more interested in kind of children's experience as an intermediate realm that sort of was influenced by a lot of different factors, rather than having a strong nativist. Okay, they're inborn, their aggressiveness, and there's nothing you can do about it, or they're entirely shaped by their mother's attitude or mothering approach.
What do you think is a contribution to understanding Taiwan, and particularly understanding Taiwan's development and the Kuomintang in the post-war Kuomintang dictatorship, right at the point, probably at this time, the standard of living was still a little bit lower than it had been before the Japanese invasion of China, because the Japanese withdrew all sorts of resources from Taiwan to support their imperial war effort. But anyway, it was still a poor country. What can we learn from family, children, parenting, village atmosphere that would, contribute to Taiwan studies outside of the people who are interested in child development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first of all, to be honest, is to recover a obscured history, or it's a very sort of accurate portray in a detailed way about these children's life at that particular, as you said, is a very particular historical point, and that we don't have materials like that tell us, okay, what are these? Imagine these children later will become sort of the pillars of the society, and waves of social movements, reform, and so on and so forth. But what was like growing up? I mean, for these children in that particular time point and context, I think that is something of to document history. That is, we as scholars can do at the very least if we have those materials. For example, the one thing I wanted to write about, perhaps as part of the book or later as some separate writing, is maybe their understanding of money, children's understanding of money. They were, as Arthur said in his manuscript, they were even poor by the local standard at the time. I think in the village, the household, the males were earning 20 to 30 yuan, new Taipei yuan a day, and wage labor, and women were like washing clothes or picking up rocks and doing other sort of work. They have mixed income, but it's in general pretty poor, and children got to consume and got to be exposed to the consumption world a lot, because they have several shops in the village, like three little shops. And children constantly nag on parents to buy candy, popsicle, eraser. And at school, the one thing that was really interesting is that they have maybe more than 200 school observations. The teacher, one important theme is teacher urging children to have their parents collect fees. And then it's very hard to collect fees. I assume across all these sort of interactions, they are exposed to the idea of money and in some way maybe social class, and from a very early age, and that is a picture that is quite different from today. Like my child growing up here, and his understanding of money and consumption. So that is just like one example of the more economic aspect. And in terms of political aspect, that is also something I'm very interested in, and I need to actually consult more historical materials outside the archive to be able to make any solid claims. But but there are clues about how children were shaped by that particular political atmosphere. So at schools, right, their classroom, their class name is 中班 and 小班, and they're probably learning a bunch of 三民主义 and other slogans. And then even in the archive doesn't have, it was not the focus at that time for Arthur and Margery Wolf, which you wrote in your Golden Age of China ethnography, the asynchronic bias, right? Is not to, they were not trying to understand Taiwan society in its particular historical context, but rather to project, to see Chinese cultural society of traditional sort. So they didn't collect, for example, the textbooks or the fine-grained messages conveyed to children that is of political significance. But through bits and here and there in the archive, I am interested in trying to understand how is their mind, how is their kind of, that is at the formative years, right, of these children, understanding about these big concepts like whatever nation or politics, how is that sort of manifest in their daily life. They were interacting with policemen. There was a police station right outside the village, and they were scared by police. They mentioned that police will come in inspecting cleaning, which is very specific to that time in that context. And they were scared by, they understand that police will come catch gamblers, for example, when they were playing gambling game, or using the cards that adults left over, and then playing gambling game, and another child teasing or scaring, oh, police is coming to catch you because of your gambling, and some other little one cried on the spot. So it's these kind of little stories that try to get me thinking about, okay, what are they thinking and perceiving and experiencing these larger historical and political forces? And another example is the projective test, or projective test that I mentioned, the psychological personality test. So for the previous generation, including the Sixth Culture Study, and probably including Arthur himself, they didn't pay much attention to these data because they think, okay, children are just relating their daily life. They're not really projecting fantasy, imagination, as these tests meant to elicit. But in my opinion, that is exactly where their imagination meets their reality, and that is what children can tell us. So in those materials, when the child was shown a picture of two children, maybe in a sort of conflictual state, or even not, or even very neutral states, just two children, they will immediately interpret, okay, they were fighting and police will come and get them. They sometimes even elaborate on the more violent scenarios. Okay, well, so-and-so holding a knife and cutting and somebody is beaten to death. And just like, that is the most salient topic children mentioned across all the TAT, the projective tests. And I suspect it has to do with not only the larger historical context, but also the local context of, I don't know, gangsters, and they mentioned that. They mentioned for example, one girl mentioned that, oh, my mom told me on the street, the gangsters just use a knife to just to kill you, and things like that. You would, that is definitely different from my experience or my child's experience. So these are the political, or the in that history, the political aspect is also visible even in these children's imaginations. But for that, I am interested in exploring more, looking at the textual materials and other things. And on the flip side, we probably have a lot of research on textbooks on the macro level, political ideology and policies and that, but we don't have this micro level detailed daily life historical record of this sort.
So what's the timeline? When can we expect a book?
Well, Good question. I am writing it. I have a couple of chapters drafted, and I plan to finish the manuscript by the end of this year, if possible. Of course, there's always uncertainties, but I really hope to be able to finish the book manuscript and to present it to the world.
Well, I think that people from Taiwan Studies, from people studying Chinese family, especially psychological anthropologists, anthropologists of gender and childhood and social change, and even rural-urban relations are going to have a treat when this book is available to people. So we've been talking to Dr. Xu Jing from the University of Washington about her fascinating research into the ethnographic archive compiled by Arthur Wolf and Margery Wolf in Shashizhou, New Taipei County, now in New Taipei City, Taiwan. And I want to thank Dr. Xu for giving us some really interesting examples to think about and for giving us a preview taste of what's going to be a very important and fascinating book. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. My great pleasure.